Hey everyone, welcome back to Vidhammer. I've been enjoying some downtime recently, trying to get people interested in doing board game events out here in Boise, but I've been missing doing the videos that I used to. So I'm going to start doing board game instruction videos, something I've been thinking about doing for quite a while now. But before I can start doing any of those, I've got to have myself a nice gaming table to actually film doing stuff on. Hence the nature of this video, which will be my how-to video on making the board game table that I have right in front of me right now. Now, it's not very expensive if you've got some basic tools yourself, or at least have access to a friend that will let you borrow them for a little while. The total cost for the materials on this is only about $125. In the long run, it's probably easier to simply buy a table if all you need is something to go in your living room or your dining room. But I needed something specific. I didn't have a lot of space where I was at the time. In the couple of weeks that have transpired since then, I have plenty of space. I have a designated game room now. But at the time, I needed something that was easy to move out of the way, something that I could take relatively easy to different events and to friends' houses. But I didn't want to sacrifice the joy of playing on something that was actually designed for board games. A lot of tables that you can actually get online, especially portable ones, are very specific. They've got, inbuilt cup holders, or they're just particularly flimsy and not really what I wanted. They're not big enough, or they're too clumsy. Whatever the nature, I wanted to build something specific, which is what I created here. I came up with this idea for a 6-foot by 3.5-foot table with a removable padded bumper that goes around the edge. I made something similar to this several years ago, but it was incredibly sturdy, the downside being that it was incredibly heavy. I needed something that was light enough that I would be able to move it by myself, but sturdy enough that when people played at it, they weren't going to feel like they were going to break it. The tools I used to put this together are most importantly a good drill that I used quite a bit. A simple circular saw that I only needed for about 6 cuts. And just to keep things cheap, I used a miter box for my angled cuts. But feel free to use an actual table saw or an angled saw if you have access to one, because it will make it a lot easier. I just wanted to show that you can still make something good, even if you don't have that much. Hardware-wise, you'll also need some drill bits and driver bits. And if you're going to try this, go ahead and get a countersink bit if you don't have one, because it's going to make the end result a lot nicer. You'll also need a staple gun, a box cutter or a knife, a tape measure, a sanding block, and a pencil of some type. Hopefully you've got access to all that so it doesn't cost you anything. If you do need to get a miter box and a saw, those are pretty cheap. The saw that I used was a very cheap $40 version. I would not recommend it for anything other than light duty, like getting through this table or something similar. If you try to cut anything thick or cut for any duration, you're just going to burn up a motor. If you are buying tools, though, the one thing I would recommend spending the good amount of money on is a drill. Having the ability to change the bits in and out is very helpful on a project like this. It can be a little more pricey, but it's well worth the money. Get something that is going to last as far as a drill goes, and you won't be sorry. I also use a set of gloves and knee pads because this would be horrible without them, and a nice tool belt because it's important to look badass. Now for the lumber. The surface is a single 4 by 8 foot sheet of 1/2-inch particle board that goes for about $18. There's 5 pieces of 8-foot 2x2s that are used to make the box frame for the surface of the table and to make the base for the bumper that goes around the edge. The top for the bumper is made from 3 pieces of 1x3s. And finally, I used a couple of 2x4s as crossbeams to give the table stability, but also to have something to mount the legs on instead of screwing them straight into the particle board. The 2x2s go for about $1.65 a piece. The 1x3s were around $2, and the 2x4s about $2.75. All 8-foot boards for those. Other supplies that I used were 1.5-inch screws, about 170, 2.5-inch screws, about 40, medium sandpaper. I used a single sheet, so it should be pretty easy to come by. You're only using a very small amount of painter's putty, so get the smallest container you have, or if you've got anybody on your block that has some, any contractor's going to have it, just borrow theirs. You're going to be using a couple of tablespoons worth. And the steel folding table legs, which I got from a hardware store. You can get them online, probably from about $22 to $26, $27. Fabric-wise, I have some low loft batting that was about $12. A 24 by 72 inch roll of half-inch project foam that was about $15. 2 yards of vinyl fabric for $10. 2 yards of the surface felt, which can go for about $15. This is where you would want to spend a little bit more money because you're going to be playing on that surface the whole time. Then a can of spray adhesive for about $4. I started the construction by trimming the particle board sheet down to the size that I wanted for the tabletop. Using my 2x2s as a makeshift workbench, just make sure your cutting blade is high enough off the ground. Then, after some geometry and algebra, I took the corners off to give the table 3 equal sitting areas at each end. I didn't have the camera rolling for this part, so I filmed this stunning mock example instead. The next step was to make the box frame for the table surface, so I break out the miter box and get to it. Now, technically, I would need to cut the ends of the support boards to 22.5 degrees. But I'm doing this the easy way, so I just keep both of the long sides and the 2 end pieces as normal. Then I make 45-degree cuts for the pieces that go in between. I realize this makes it so the boards don't line up perfectly, but the underside of the table doesn't matter, and I have a little trick up my sleeve when it comes to making the bumper. I drill in some holding screws, but they're only to hold the frame in place, as I'll be putting the real screws in from the top side. Just make sure when you do this that you don't put your holding screw all the way through the surface of the tabletop, but just enough to hold it in place. A helpful hint, which if you're building something you probably already know, but if you're ever trying to figure out what size bit to use in order to drill a pilot hole for your screws, what I was always taught is if you hold the screw up and put the drill bit in front of it, you should just see the threads behind the drill bit. But if you hold the drill bit behind the screw, you shouldn't see the drill bit at all. There you go. With the box frame held in place, I go through and trim off any edges that might be sticking out due to improper measurement, and sand off the corners of the edges as well. It would be better to wait and do this after the top was fully screwed on, but it wouldn't be Vidhammer if I didn't screw something up. Then I start putting in the actual screws from the top side about every 3 to 4 inches, drilling pilot holes first and then using the countersink bit and finally driving in the screw. I also put some of the long screws into the end joints just to give some extra stability. With that done, it's safe to take out the temporary screws from the bottom side. I'm going to be using 2x4s to go widthwise to give myself more stability and to have something to mount the actual legs off of. So I don't want to go straight into the plywood with it. They'd be flimsy, let's just say that. Unfortunately, even with the legs compacted a little bit to give myself a little more leg room from underneath, I'm going to end up having to cut into the side corner of the 2x4s because of the angle I put at the end of the table. But oh well, that's how it goes. Nothing too major, just a little funny cut I'm going to have to do towards the end. I cut 4 pieces of 2x4 to go the width of the underside of the table. Then I lay them out with the table legs so I can get an accurate idea of how much of a corner I have to cut off so they'll fit where I need them. I line the legs up again and mark the positions for the 2x4s. Then I screw them in through the sides of the 2x2s. To make the table legs as sturdy as possible, I secure the 2x4s from the top with more wood screws and an alternating side-to-side pattern so I can use as many screws as I want without splitting the boards underneath. Before putting the table legs on, I use the tabletop as my template for making the frame of the bumper, since it will need to be just slightly larger than the tabletop all the way around, so that I'll be able to take it on and off easily. The only difference from the box frame is that this time the pieces have to line up completely on both sides, which means part of the in-between boards would be sticking out from the table due to these 45-degree angle cuts. So we just make another cut to remove the part we don't want, and success. Just remember that you need some wiggle room in this step, since there will be several layers of fabric between the tabletop and the bumper. Now I go ahead and screw the table legs onto the 2x4 supports and get ready to finish the bumper. The top pieces for the bumper can be a little tricky, but it's still not rocket science. You just want the top piece to be flush with the outside edge of the bottom piece. That way, part of the top piece will be resting on the actual surface of the table. You also have to cut the extra piece of the corners so that they'll line up. But in order to make the bumper as stable as possible, I actually alternate which boards are angled and which are normal. When we made the 2x2 frame, the long boards and the end pieces were normal, and the in-between boards were cut at an angle. Now for the 1x3s, I cut the long boards and the end pieces at a 45-degree angle and keep the in-between boards normal. That way we can put this one extra screw into the spot where they overlap. This doesn't seem like much, but it does make a noticeable difference. It's not a hard change to make if you cut yourself a little template that you can use to mark your cuts with. The easiest way to do this whole step is just to make the 45-degree cuts first and screw those boards in so you can make simple measurements of what length boards you need to go in between. With a few more of those end piece screws, the bumper is done. Just be very adamant about drilling pilot holes or those end pieces will crack off. Now I finish off the tabletop by using some painter's putty to fill in the screw holes. It takes this stuff a while to dry, but you can come back and scrape off the excess after a little while, which will let you get on with the rest of the project. The table shouldn't look too bad at this point, and it's a good idea to put the bumper on and see if you need to make any alterations before going to the next step. If the bumper wobbles, try swapping some of the boards around or flipping them over if they're a little too warped. Once you've got it sitting steady, it's time to put the batting down on the surface. The spray adhesive is pretty strong stuff, so lay out your batting beforehand so you can just roll it across the tabletop. Having someone help you with this step makes it a lot easier, so of course I did it myself. I had enough batting to make 2 passes, and since it's pretty thin, I was planning on it anyways. Just need to put a second layer of glue between the layers, just like a cake. Then trim off the excess with scissors, and it's time to do the same thing with our surface felt. Lay the fabric out beforehand again to reduce any wrinkling, and this time make sure to spray the adhesive on the edge of the table as well as the surface to help the fabric cling on. Since I was going solo again, I sprayed one side and attached it first, then went back to do the other half. Make sure to pull the fabric down real tight before sticking it to the edge of the table, as the batting is going to compact significantly over a few days. Use the staple gun to put some staples into the sides to hold the fabric down as well. Just don't go hog wild because you will probably be removing them all after a year or two to switch out the felt. Trim off the excess with scissors, and it's time for the bumper. I start off this part by cutting my foam padding into 8-inch wide strips, since that's enough to wrap around the bumper with a little to spare. Then I cut the length that I need for whatever board I'm working on. I start with the long sides and the ends, then I come back and fill in the gaps later. For each board, I spray the outside edge and the top first and attach the foam to those sides, before lifting the frame up to spray the inside and underneath to attach the rest of the foam. This is so any excess that I have to trim off will be on the underside of the bumper, where it won't leave a visible edge. Filling in the gaps is the tough part since you have to eyeball a lot of the trimming. Just realize that it doesn't have to be perfect. With that finished, the last step is adding the vinyl to the bumper. If you really wanted, you could sew together the edges where the fabric pieces meet, but since we're securing them with staples on the underside anyway, it really isn't worth the effort. Instead, just do 4 of the sides with a little extra room on the ends. Then for the in-between sections, turn under a little extra material to hide the end of the fabric. You'll probably find this step easier to do with the bumper turned upside down. Just make sure the seam of the fabric lines up with the angles in the frame. You'll also find the final product better if you staple the underside first, then wrap the fabric around to overlap before stapling it down and trimming off the excess. And there it is, a somewhat cheap and easy portable game table that doesn't suck. and also the first step to all of these. Till next time, from Vidhammer, have fun.